We will now start, and sorry for the small delay. We were waiting for having everybody both online and in presence here in Geneva. So let me welcome all of you here, be in the room, in the ILO or online. I'd like a special welcome in particular to our colleagues from FCDO, from the International Domestic Worker Federation. The High Commissioner for Human Rights is also online. Other UN agencies have confirmed their participation. I can't see actually the list of everybody online, but confirm were colleague from IOM, UNCDF, I think FAO, UNODC, sorry, ACT Alliance. Some government has also confirmed their presence from Norway, from USDOL, and of course my colleague from the ILO here present in the room, but also online, in particular from India. Your presence and the interest for the theme of promoting decent work and fighting against forced labor in particular is very much welcome, and it comes as a particular moment. And let me first introduce myself. I'm Philippe Van Jonigem. I'm the head of the Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work branch here based in Geneva. It's really a pleasure to have you all for that. And as I said, it comes at a particular moment. The first thing I would like to say is that with regard to forced labor, the situation is not good. We have seen that over the last few weeks. We have released a few days ago our new global report on the estimation, the global estimate on forced labor, and we have today almost 28 million people in forced labor. That's 3 million more than 5 years ago when we released a similar report in global estimate. And women and girls are particularly affected by that phenomena. Only if we talk about forced sexual exploitation, we know that 80% of people in sexual exploitation are women and girls. So forced labor has a woman face. We all know that. We also know that some sectors are particularly vulnerable to forced labor. This is true for construction. It's true also for garments and for domestic workers. And women's work in many low-income sectors remain unrecognized, unpaid, or poorly valued. This reality is actually often systematically abused, and it's allow industries and employers to hire lower paid workers. The fight against forced labor has to be intrinsically linked to the recognition of women's work, its proper valuation, and curtailing violence at work. These include recognizing domestic work as work and advocate for the ratification and implementation of the Convention 189 and preventing violence and harassment in accordance to the recent, a few years now, adoption of Convention 190. And we have the tendency, when I was mentioning the figures about forced labor, to accuse COVID and the recent crisis, sanitary crisis. The truth is that COVID has actually exacerbated already existing systematic problems that exist in our society. We also acknowledge and witness an increased interest, on the other hand, in both low-income countries and medium and high-income countries to tackle the issue of trafficking and forced labor, much more than a few years ago. And I think this type of program, Working Freedom Program, and others have contribute to put on the table, on the policy agenda, those type of topics that were hidden in the past. And let's be very clear, we know the solution. And conventional approaches that were used 5-10 years ago, focusing the fight against trafficking and forced labor in particular, penalizing what we could call the bad employers or the bad actors, or protecting the victim of human trafficking and forced labor, criminalizing those issues is only part of the solution. We all know the problem are complex and need much more integrated approach. I don't like the term integrate, but what it means if we don't tackle the root cause of forced labor and trafficking, we will probably not end forced labor and trafficking as a whole. And I think one of the key lessons that the program has shown is the importance to tackle the different root cause of forced labor, working on the voice of workers in society, working on the driver of discrimination in society, and that will diminish the overall vulnerability of people, in particular, those who are more at risk, like migrant population. We also know that forced labor is unevenly distributed among workers in the world of work. Migrant, and the global estimate I shown, represent 3 times more people in forced labor than other categories of workers. And that's very important to mention. So targeting a certain category of people does not mean leaving or not putting a universal rights on all other categories. It means taking into consideration the specificity of certain categories of people. The three other elements I want to mention here. We will discuss during this seminar the lessons that has been drawn for a almost 10 years program, Work in Freedom program. This is absolutely exceptional that support has been brought by DFID, FCDO for such a long period. And it would be a shame somehow that the ILO, its partner, we don't capitalize on what has been done to better understand the structural problem that face migrant population, discrimination issue, forced labor, and what are the root causes that I mentioned. So this exercise, although it's not a per se an evaluation, it's a serious work that try to study in depth what has been the root cause, and we can draw policies and priority based on that. Also mention that this Work in Freedom program is actually part of a much larger effort of the ILO and its member states to tackle the issue of forced labor and the migrant population. And this is part also of the Fair Recruitment Initiative that the ILO has pushed for quite some years now. Related to the Fair Recruitment Initiative, the ILO examined the situation of the migrant population and the relation with fundamental rights and the condition of work of migrant population on different angles. First, it recognized that recruitment is a critical stage if we want to fight against forced labor and discrimination in general terms. And for migrant population, it's so important. Second, when we identify, design, and implement solutions which are oriented to address the recruitment challenges and the fees related to recruitment, we can address one of the root causes of forced labor for migrant population. So a series and the lessons learned that's been studied by the WIF program is part of a larger effort to document what the Fair Recruitment Initiative is also doing, to put in place policy which are based on evidence, and that's ever more true. Through the Fair Recruitment Initiative, the ILO actually convene and facilitate dialogue, and that's exactly the same approach that the WIF program has put in place. It's through the dialogue that solution of complex problem can be found by the stakeholders that work in a given country, in a given context. And saying it's extremely important. We work on migration issue and the fight against forced labor and other fundamental rights in now over than 30 countries, among which the country that the WIF program was doing. And I'm personally extremely convinced that this human problem that is created, forced labor is a human problem, will be eradicated if there is a real human political will to do so. It's feasible, as we mentioned in our global estimate report, if both the political will is put in place through practical action, if means, including technical and financial means, are put on the table. And if obviously we take the lessons of past experience and we put that into very concrete policy. And that's exactly the purpose of this seminar and the dissemination of the report that has been drawn. Thank you very much. So I now pass the floor, I think, to my colleague, Dagmar. It's a real pleasure to have you here. You're the director of the December team based in Delhi and managing the whole program. So I leave you the floor to moderate the next session of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Philippe, and really happy to be here with you today. And happy also to see so many participants who have joined. And it's my pleasure to moderate the presentation session of this program. Yeah, I'm the director of ILO New Delhi office. We cover South Asia with a technical support team and also India as a country office. And of course, I think we are really, I have followed this program over the last 5 years. And this is really the region that mostly is equated with the sourcing and, the originating country of women migrant labor. And they're really happy also to have, colleagues here from more the destination countries. And I think that is one of the really beauties and forces of this 10-year program, that bringing together both sides, and I'm really excited to hear more about what has worked and what did maybe not work. So maybe just before I hand over to Igor to do the first part of the presentation, I would like to say some more words around that also here in South Asia we're very much concerned as part of advancing the decent work agenda with the issue of forced labor. And in a way, given the lasting challenges related to poverty and informality, this subcontinent has grappled with persistent and new forms also of abusive labor relations. Despite the challenges of forced labor, we have also seen that a lot of good legislative instruments have been developed to address bonded labor, although there is scope for, I would say, improved implementation. And important social movement to eradicate bonded labor has really been there to help keep up the momentum and interest in overcoming many of the challenges. I would also like to say that it is particularly noteworthy that Bangladesh recently ratified the forced labor protocol, and we encourage, of course, other countries in this region to consider the same step to strengthen really the action to eradicate forced labor. And the forced labor protocol offers really a comprehensive set of preventive measures that countries and stakeholders can implement. Now, obviously, we are very grateful, as you also mentioned, Philippe, to the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office for having had the vision, I would say, and the perseverance and persistence in supporting the Work in Freedom program during 10 years. And such long-term support, I would say, for an adaptive learning program really has played an instrumental role in successfully testing what works and doesn't. And a few bilateral donors actually have demonstrated such level of commitment. Now, yes, the Work in Freedom program has very rich lessons, has generated rich lessons because of its, I would say, innovative and on-the-ground work, but also in terms of undertaking very good research. And these lessons are to be shared. They build on actually experience in several countries, really in depth, in India, Nepal and Bangladesh, as well as Jordan, Lebanon and Kuwait. And these, so you see a bit, the two regions, right, collaborating on this initiative. These lessons are particularly useful to understand women's work in sectors such as domestic work and garment work. Now, just before I hand over to Igor, I would like to say that yes, we might have wanted to, organize a physical event and to really include all the constituents and partners who participated in this program. However, there was no scope to do that this time, so hence we are organizing and doing this hybrid presentation today. And I must say it also has some advantages to meet in this format. Given that we don't have to travel and we kind of can all connect and spend this moment and time together. Now, coming to the presenters of the lessons learned, I will first hand over to Igor Bosk, who is the Chief Technical Advisor of the program, and then to Zeina Medzer, who will be presenting the findings of the program. Following this, Andrew Clayton from FCDO will also make some comments, and then we open up for a question and answer session. So Igor, let me turn over to you first, and if you could share with us, please, the insights on what works and what doesn't work in implementing anti-trafficking in women programs in countries of all regions, we can say, of origin of migrant women. Over to you, Igor.
Thank you very much, Dagmar. And thank you to colleagues who have joined us. Just before I start, I want to say a few technical words. If you will be talking further, particularly during the question and answer sections, please turn on your microphones, but then turn it off so that it doesn't create any interference. And second, we're also monitoring the chat box. So yeah, please do not hesitate to also send some messages if you have any comments on that. Okay, so we're gonna start. I would like to say that what I'll be presenting today is not only the effort of myself, it's the effort of a team not only of ILO colleagues, but of various different partners, many of which are present today online, and so we're very happy to have you here. It's a pity that not all of you necessarily have been here, but I would like to say that, and we're very happy that Zeina has joined us and will be making a presentation from here in Geneva. So over to the lessons, to these findings that we have and what works and doesn't. And we will be dividing this session in three. One is in countries of origin. What is it that, what types of interventions and policies actually work or don't in the countries of origin. Then there will be a part which is about recruitment. So the intermediation between countries of origin and the countries of destination or areas of destination. And then finally, the countries of destination. Now, countries of destination are not only countries in the Gulf or in West Asia. These are countries which, these are also areas like the big cities, the big metros of India, of South Asia in general, where there's a lot of migration as well. So, so even though we talk about countries of destination, we interpret that in a large manner. And these lessons are all available online. I have shared them in the invitation, and we also have them available. We have them here, so we have 3 different versions. So for those of you who are here within the room, you'll find you can take copies, which are there on the back side. So with that, we're going to start. I'm just going to start sharing the presentation. Please bear with me just a second. So as I just mentioned, we will be having 3 sessions, but then we'll have a preliminary introduction. We'll explain a little bit the methodology of how we explain the findings that we have, and we'll be having a conclusion at the very end that wraps up all the findings to look forward at what can be done. All the pictures, most of the pictures here, 80% were taken in the context of the program, and these are actually in some way have been beneficiaries in one way or another. So Just a few points to recap. This is a program that has 10 years of experience. It was funded by UK Aid. The overall aim was to reduce vulnerability to forced labor. And this is throughout the migration context of women going to domestic work and to garment work. The program has adopted an integrated and target approach to developing practices and multi-sectoral policy measures. The program is primarily based, as Dagmar mentioned, in Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Jordan, Lebanon, and to a limited extent, we worked in Kuwait. We cooperate with migrant women workers, with trade unions, civil society organizations, businesses, and of course, with government counterparts. The interventions are of 5 types that can be summarized. One is outreach to migrant women in areas where they come from, either in rural areas, but also in urban areas as well. There's a whole side in the destination areas of empowerment through different types of interventions, including directly with the workers, but also with employers. There's a whole angle of work which focuses on improving recruitment practices. Fourth, there's an angle of work which is really working on the policies and the laws that are related to reducing vulnerability to forced labor. And finally, there's a whole research side with a series of publications, some of which we have available today, but most of which are actually online and I shared with you. So how do we come about these findings? We have basically structured this in the following way. We have we will be describing main finding, how the finding was identified, including links to references and so on, and what are the practical lessons for the future. So what are the better practices that can be designed or not from this lesson. And this is, of course, based on the implementation of the program. And also very important to mention that each of these lessons is connected to specific interventions that were designed as part of an overall framework of interventions. So none of these lessons should be read in isolation from one another. So we'll go directly into the first part, which is about countries of origin. Sorry. So just very briefly, the types of interventions that usually take place, they have a regulatory framework. I mean, there's a history of bilaterally agreed protections based on nationality. And of course, there's the ILO framework of rights based on the migration standards, as well as the UN International Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Their Families. And of course, there's a Palermo Protocol, which is important. And I will be explaining some of this historical context for all the types of interventions. So this is for countries of origin. There are other instruments that are applicable for the other interventions in the 2 other areas. So to give you an example, here we have some of the conventional types of interventions that are classic. There are pre-departure orientation and training programs. Usually these happen in like classroom settings, often through foreign employment departments, training departments of countries of origin. We find this very common in India, Nepal, Bangladesh. You also have this in Sri Lanka, Pakistan. You have it in Indonesia. I mean, these are very common in many of these countries. And the government usually plays a role, and so do recruitment agencies play a role in the training that actually happens there. Sometimes NGOs are involved, sometimes they aren't. Another type of intervention, which is classical, is basically resource facilitation centers for people who are about to migrate. Sometimes these are called migration resource centers. They have different names, but the point is that there is some sort of an office where information is provided. And here I'm listing some of the different types of more innovative or different interventions that were tested throughout the program. So we have pre-decision orientation sessions, which are not in a classroom. Usually it's in a community, in a rural area, or in a slum somewhere, basically direct informal interaction with, in this case, women workers who are aspiring workers. Then there is another type of intervention, which is about strengthening the capacity of social workers and of local women leaders to reach out to these women who are seeking jobs. And third, you have this direct type of outreach by social workers to women considering employment and all this interaction. And finally, there you have unions actually in areas of origin reaching out to women for employment. And so this is very interesting. We have several years of experience trying to do this, and we'll share some information about what works and doesn't. So we have divided the lessons in each section according to a certain number of sessions. I won't be explaining every single session because I think there's more than 100 and we wouldn't have time for this. So I'll be selecting 1 or 2 lessons from each chapter. And then if you have any questions later, we'd be very happy to delve into some of the lessons which we did not explain to illustrate some points. And I invite you to actually also go through the publication to see the rest. So these are particularly lessons on the migratory trends. And one of the first ones, so here we're entering into the depth of the topic, is that migration of women depends on how specific context of patriarchy and how women's mobility, work seeking, and distress is socially appraised and mediated. The more women's mobility and work is restricted and socially stigmatized, the more women will simply not migrate, or if they are desperate to leave, migrate suddenly and secretly to avoid stigma. For those who have never migrated, migration all of a sudden can be risky, even if staying back is equally undesirable for a variety of reasons. So this is very important to set the context on the migratory trends. Another point, very important, is that the cost of blue-collar international migration of women tends to be lower. The cost of migration tends to be lower than that for men in the region. When we talk about cost of migration, the discourse in general in the sphere of migration policy debates tends to collapse what is the cost for men and women. In reality, at least what we see in South Asia is that the cost for women migrating can still be significant sometimes not, but is significantly lower than it is for the men. So it's important because it nuances the general debate on cost of migration and recruitment, which applies differently for men and women for different reasons. And I can enter into those reasons if there are questions, but we'll move on for the sake of time. The other point, also extremely important, is that migration through formal channels or migration to formal work does not guarantee protection from abuses. And while migrating through informal channels involves risks, legal channels into formal work situations can also lead to abusive labor situations. And one of the most clear indicators of that is, for instance, the sponsorship system, which is anchored in law in many of the West Asian countries. And so it doesn't offer much of an opportunity to, that's the formal mechanism, and it gives extreme power to an employer to decide the fate of the worker. So in that type of situation, it creates enormous vulnerability for workers from start. So it's not formality in itself that it's going to protect. And this is very important because many countries in countries of origin will say, if you go through the formal way, then you will be protected. And actually, it's not that clear. I mean, yes, sometimes it can help, but it also, there's evidence to the contrary as well. So this is important to really take into account. The next set of lessons, which is related to basically political economy considerations related to pre-departure programs. And we're going to see that while the public narratives claim that pre-departure policies and programs are needed to protect workers, migrant workers, in reality, migrant workers' interests tend to be crowded out of these institutional programs by other competing and more powerful interests of employers, recruiters, and local authorities. It leaves little, if any, space for migrant workers to voice their views and learn about negotiation and organizing practices to defend their own labor rights. So we can go into more details if there's any questions, but it's really important to really picture that in reality, the main policy objective of governments in countries of origin is to promote foreign employment and the remittances that are associated with that. And at the same time, you have interest of recruiters who are basically also interested in participating to be able to train the workers who are going to then be connected to jobs in the countries of destination. And so there's, of course, all these business dynamics and agreements, and there's very little space to actually talk about how to improve the working conditions once you are abroad. And so that space can only be opened up in certain ways, and we're going to see how that works. The choice of locations to promote migration tends to be guided by political considerations, which don't always relate to migration trends. So what we mean by this is that many times in countries of origin, we'll be told to work here or there. But there's often political reasons, there's development trends, there's like investment trends for trying to push people to migrate in certain places and not in others. And it's important for multilateral organizations not to remain unaware of this and be sure that we're not in some way undermining the rights of people to remain if they wish to, or to migrate if they wish to as well. The other point, which is also important, is that this can be misunderstood very easily, but it's that safe migration interventions tend to be ineffective in preventing the violation of women's rights. While safe migration programs can be helpful, in patriarchal context, the concept of safety and protection tends to exclude women's agency. And so to us, in here sitting in Geneva, it might seem that safe migration is the right term to promote the types of programs that will protect and uphold the rights of workers. But in reality, in many of these local contexts, patriarchy is really such that the concept of safety tends to be used as a way of interpreting that, women are victims before being agents and having rights. And so it's important to be very careful on the words that we use when we promote different points. So we chose not to talk about safe migration, but rather to talk of mobility by choice, because that's a more empowering concept. And it's not always easy, but that was one important lesson that we had. So the next series of lessons here are basically on the relationships between development actors and migrant women. Migration and anti-trafficking programs should be aware of the social distance that separates migrant women workers and those who decide to implement such programs at various levels. There are very different class indicators of people who are involved in implementing these programs, whether it's even a social worker or whether it's an ILO staff. Of course, the distance is even a bit larger, and migrant women who are in a very specific situation trying to migrate. And so it's very important to bridge that gap. And so we have a lot to learn from these migrant women, as well as provide information about the realities of work abroad. So it's a two-way process, which is important to go through. The lessons learned between the relationship between development actors and migrant women. pre-departure skilling is more effective when women workers organizations are involved. And so every time you have either a woman's trade union or organization which is involved in providing these pre-departures, it's much more effective. They know how they have often experience from people who have migrated, and so this is much more successful. And today we have colleagues from ILO DWT who've experienced this not only in our region, but I think in other places in the world as well. So the next set of lessons is on most specifically the village level, grassroots level interventions that we implemented. And here, as promoted by civil society organizations, international organizations, and the government, migration awareness tends to be supply driven and rarely includes representative voices of those it is intended for. So it's very important to create spaces for women to be able to interact. These are villages which are often which are very patriarchal. You have a lot of it's very conservative environment, and even getting together and having opportunity for women to talk between each other is something that can be slightly threatening for the local community. So creating these spaces has to be explained. It cannot be seen as a conflict either, but at the same time, it's very important because these spaces are crucial to discuss the issues that are discussed in there. Conventional safe migration interventions tend to either prevent migration or promote it. And yet preventing migration or promoting can both be harmful. So from both a program and a policy perspective, it is important neither to stop women from migrating nor encouraging them to migrate. At least that's what we saw. We saw both patterns. We saw some conservative approaches that were represented mostly by anti-trafficking NGOs that inflated the risk of trafficking and forced labor, and failed to see that women needed jobs to make ends meet and that it was their right to find employment. And there was a more liberal approach that was represented by some migrant rights organizations who sometimes exaggerated the benefits of migration and minimized its risk. So I think we shouldn't either be promoting, or preventing migration. So that's another important lesson from a programmatic perspective to mention. In order to better reach out to women who may migrate, the content of information shared with them should not exclusively focus on migration. Usually the conventional way is we provide information about what's going to happen abroad. This is the job you're going to have. This is how you migrate. This is how your passport is. This is what you're supposed to do. And often, the migration is very complicated, and often it depends on different types of choices that families have to take. And migration can be much more secure and enabling if those choices are there. And it may involve knowing more about local job opportunities, knowing more about local services, access to health services that would prevent them from having to spend a lot of money abroad to try to solve some problem with their family, with their health situation. I mean, there's a whole variety of factors which can prevent migration from happening. And so it's a lot of the women with whom we work with would tell us that it's very important that we are able to talk not only about migration, but also about their own rights in the community, about local labor opportunities, about a variety of different topics. And so we had to craft a lot of our interventions to tailor it to their demands. And that was very instructful in the process, and we'll be able to answer some questions that are regarding that. Finally, the assumptions behind programs seeking to inform and empower should really be carefully reviewed. And here we have I just go through a few. So in classical conventional programs, there's a fixed content of pre-departure programs. It's usually compulsory for people who are supposed to be there, for the women who are there. And it targets all the migrating women. In a better practice, the content is flexible and adapted to the demand. It's voluntary and need-based, and it doesn't address all migrating women. It gives preference to first-time migrant women who may need more information if they need it. So this is just an example of the types of assumptions, and there are many, which I won't go into details. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague who's going to talk now about recruitment. So over to you, Zaina.
Thank you, Igor. Actually, I'm not very happy that I'm talking about recruitment. I must admit that exploring the issue of recruitment after 10 years of working on the program triggers like two contradictory emotions. One of deception, because there's a reality that recruitment agencies are often one step ahead of us. And that makes it very challenging when we test all the instruments that we have at hand. Philippe talked about the fair recruitment initiatives, and we're going to explore it further in the lessons learned. But the other emotion is that of inspiration, because again, the program offered the opportunity to test and go in deep to make the connections between recruitment, policies, organizing, and all what's happening in the field. And again, it produced a lot of knowledge that we hope that the participants are going to take it further, not just within the ILO, but beyond. So with that, we're going to go deeper into exploring some of the lessons learned in recruitment. And here it's also important to highlight that the issue of recruitment is framed within the international labor standards of the ILO. So there is a historical context. Before the Fair Recruitment Initiative, there was the Unemployment Convention #2, and which evolved into also the Private Recruitment and Employment Convention in '97, which formalized the role of private agencies and also shifted kind of the role from the national public agencies into more private agencies. There are question marks, how much that works or not, or what is the room to rethink also the approach of the role of public employment agencies, especially in countries where there's growing vulnerability within the systems and where reform is very slow. So leaving everything to the private sector has also its own challenges, and we can see that clearly in the recruitment. And then it evolved into the general principles and operational guidelines for fair recruitment, which is, of course, is not a binding instrument, but it's also very important in how it reframed the discussion around recruitment. And in the program, we were inspired by the Fair Recruitment Initiative, but also the field teach us a lot. And this is the beauty of the ILO, is that the instruments are not just a stagnating instrument. We have our international labor standards here who can correct me if I'm wrong. So this is why the lessons learned are also hopefully going to feed into also the future work, into whether it's not an assessment of the Fair Recruitment Initiative, but it's again a reality check on what works and what doesn't work. So if we look at how the conventional programs to improve recruitment of migrant workers, what do they focus on? They are mainly influenced by the non-binding standards and the anti-trafficking concerns. So the traditional interventions are promotion of fair recruitment policies. But then again, what's fair recruitment if it's not linked to an enabling environment for decent work? If I give a very specific example, if you have recruitment agencies in countries of origin and in destination, both committed to the fair recruitment principles, and yet when a migrant worker arrives at destination, there is no laws or policies that hold the employer accountable if they confiscate a passport, or where there's no access to justice, the fair recruitment principles here becomes just, like ink on paper. So this is where it's important to within the angles that we took in the program, to revisit when we talk about promoting fair recruitment agencies and how it's important to link it to policies. And when we talk about training on fair and ethical recruitment for labor recruiters, I must admit, like if we take the example of Lebanon, the training targeting recruitment agencies worked to our disadvantage because they were so empowered in the ILS standards and understanding the labor standards that they use it to challenge the reform that we were trying to propose. And for example, they put on hold a standard unified contract, which was in line with international standards, because they knew all the arguments, because they were trained on the arguments, but they did not commit to them. So again, the approach on training on fair and ethical recruitment and the capacity building for recruitment agencies and employers is something interesting to also observe from a different angle. And the assessment and certification of ethical recruitment practices, how assessing migrant recruitment practices, specifically in companies, and providing recommendations or certifications, how these sometimes are complemented by rating of recruitment agencies. And the assumption here is that the aggregation of each improvement practice will lead to better overall recruitment outcomes. We were able to also put that in practice in the field, and hence the lessons learned that we are going to share with you. So some of the main practices that were tested by Work in Freedom revolve around providing policy advice on fair recruitment as part of decent work outcomes. And that goes to working with the government counterparts, with workers' associations, and with recruitment agencies and with employers. And again, throughout the presentation, we're going to put this question mark on recruitment and employers and who is who and who is who in this process of recruitment as well. And then there's the dialogue in improving recruitment practices with intermediaries and other parties, the pathway or sector-wide assessment of recruitment practices, and testing of better recruitment practices. So for the first lesson learned is on how scale of supply and demand for jobs affect recruitment. Scarcity of decent work options on a significant scale may lead to a more labor intermediation and poor recruitment outcomes. How do we interpret that? Because it means that ad hoc efforts to improve recruitment practices along specific corridors are far from sufficient, as they fail to address both the demand for and the scarcity of decent work at significant scale. If we move on, then I will. The second is on why recruitment fees can be exploitative. And this also may be a challenging notion for ILO colleagues, but it's important to look at it and see it within a context. So while recruitment fees can be exploitative, faulting the labor intermediary who charges the fees is not sufficient. Recruitment fees are not only linked to the demand and supply of workers, but also to the demand and supply of decent jobs. And addressing the scarce supply of decent jobs is more important. And workers, of course, do not like to pay fees, and they do see that they are exploitative fees. But if we look in practice, especially in the context of migration, where people are migrating to an area where they don't know anything about, nor culturally, nor do they have a network, nor do they have an understanding of the system, sometimes they would need, even if they have to pay for that service, they need that contact, because that contact might be their only way out of a forced labor situation, right? So again, seeing the whole context and the experience of migrants was very important for us to try to understand how sometimes we should not be very kind of rigid in looking at these issues of recruitment fees and linkages throughout the migration corridor. And that takes us to another practice, which is around testing better recruitment practices and policy measures that tend to focus on the potential for success of individual cases and specific boutique practices, and yet they seldom change the wider market dynamics that frame the context in which those recruitment practices take place. So many fair and ethical recruitment initiatives of organizations are based on specific recruitment processes organized in connection with a few individuals, employers, and their representatives. But do that have an impact on the whole recruitment dynamics of the country and on the perception of employers and their relationship with the recruitment agencies or their obligations toward workers, seldom it's not. So it's very peculiar to those groups that were engaged in this, let's say, test or pilot, but it does not take us beyond that. And this is something also to think about. How can we, if we want to engage here in this corridor, how can we make sure that this will have policy implications, that this will have a wider impact than those very specific targets that benefited from this. In the part 2 of recruitment, we're going to see how the segmentation of labor recruitment services also operate and what did we learn from that. So the labor outsourcing and subcontracting policies have tended to blur the responsibilities of employers, labor intermediaries, and governments to ensure fair recruitment and decent work. Such policies have increasingly enabled private employers to delink themselves from the direct responsibility of recruiting and contracting. You talk to an employer and you tell them, like, a domestic worker has the right to a day off outside the house. They tell you it's not in the regulation. The recruitment agency did not tell me that. I signed a contract with the recruitment agency. So the direct relationship between the employer and the domestic worker, there is a complete de-link. And who's held accountable here? No one. And who pays the price? It's the worker. On a second level, the labor intermediaries de-link themselves from the working conditions. Again, when a recruitment agency gets active in promoting a destination country, they don't care to promote the work conditions, or they're not held accountable for the working conditions. So they just do their job by placing the worker somewhere. And for them, this is not their job to make sure that there's decent work environment that will be provided to the worker. So this lack of accountability in the process is something that we learned, and we think that it has to be addressed going further. The setting of working conditions by default or design in a bubble that is kept somewhat isolated from state regulation. And it's easy for the state to say, well, you know, it's between the employer and the worker. We hear it when we talk with policymakers, you know, let them deal with it, let them handle that relationship. But then the worker find themselves in very vulnerable positions. And that goes also in terms of the relation between the state and the recruitment agencies. So it's kind of like they turn a blind eye, and it's easy for that relationship to continue. And this has been further complicated by the sidelining of public employment offices in favor of private employment and recruitment agencies. We might think because it's, I don't know, is it a gender angle, and it's related to the, you know, like care work and the type of work that many migrant migrant workers are taking, and this is not the interest of the state to interfere? Is it because it's low-skilled work? There's something that's interesting to understand why the state is not being keen to strengthen the role of public employment offices and take charge of these recruitment relationships. And again, part of the lessons learned is that efforts to ensure that labor recruiters share responsibility for labor recruitment outcomes should not concurrently offload the principal employer's responsibility to provide for decent work. So again, we talked about this lack of accountability and everybody throwing the ball in the court of the other. This fluidity and segmentation of labor supply chains is really very important, and workers, labor recruiters, regulators, and employers can guarantee a fair migration outcome for any worker on their own. And this is why it should be perceived like this is a chain, and any default by any part of this chain will cause a damage for the worker and put them in vulnerable positions. The other part of the lessons learned in recruitment is related to the stigmatization of informal intermediaries. Again, this is an idea that might kind of raise some questions, and it's not a traditional approach. Like when we talk about recruitment agencies or recruitment, we think about licensed agencies, and government is often keen to do more regulations, stricter regulations on licensing. And the informal intermediaries have a role that maybe, I mean, in the future, also many actors might be interested to dig deeper into understanding that role, and not always through the stigma, the lens of stigma. And we will talk why. So the discourse on unscrupulous middlemen tends to invariably stigmatize informal labor intermediaries. And by the way, informal labor intermediaries might be sometimes workers themselves. They can act as this, intermediaries trying to help someone find a job. It's not always an official title or family members, etc. And such discourse can indirectly prevent workers from relying on informal labor intermediaries or other fellow workers in accessing employment and seeking support to exit an abusive labor migration situation. Again, in contexts where forced labor is prevalent and access to justice is kind of a closed door, sometimes the migrant workers need to have these contacts. And when we look at it from a very narrow angle that the informal intermediaries are all bad, there's this element of stigma that might also blind us at some opportunities to try to work with them, to target them in interventions, and to enable them to play a more positive role. So this is the lesson learned. And then comes something that complements what Igor mentioned earlier about training, like we talked about pre-departure training, but here we're focusing on training programs related to recruitment. So the training programs on fair and ethical recruitment for private and public recruiters tend to assume that recruiters are in control and responsible for the recruitment outcomes of migrant workers they engage with. Well, they're not, right? They have no power after the worker gets employed. This is where the job of the employer, the recruiter ends. So if there is no mechanism that provides decent work conditions, protection, access to justice, and complaint mechanism to the workers, then these training programs are missing in their scope. And we come to the lesson learned on the design of fair recruitment programs and policies. And again, this was very interesting and inspiring because it's built also on ILO instruments, which guided our whole approach in the program. And we learned that whenever prevailing working conditions are notoriously poor, promoting fair recruitment can be counterproductive in some contexts and can even amount to institutionalizing human trafficking. This is bold, right? And some colleagues might even question, how do we put this in writing? But this is the reality that we found on the ground. You cannot promote fair recruitment if you don't have, at the other end, and in the destination country, someone who's willing to take the fair principle of recruitment and decent work into account and prepare for it. So in sectors such as domestic and garment, where we focus as working freedom, where working and living conditions tend to be poor, recruitment outcomes are messy. The promotion of fair recruitments run the risk of institutionalizing recruitment into poor working conditions. And I will give you a very specific example for something that we worked even before the working freedom on, and we continued. So there's this syndicate of recruitment agencies in Lebanon, and we worked with them on the principles of fair recruitment. We helped them to develop and adopt a code of conduct that is so much in line with C181, with Fair Recruitment Initiative. When we came to monitor the implementation of this code of conduct, none of it was there. There was even element of forced labor and trafficking in their reports on how they are operating. And when we asked, how come? And they're like, this is not our fault. We commit to this, but the Lebanese government is not interested to move forward in any reform. There are bans from X country that makes it hard to connect with licensed agencies in the country of origin. So it's not our responsibility. So they have the code of conduct, assuming, I think, if they believe in it, they will have found a way. But that gave them an excuse. They were inspired by the fair recruitment, but then to put it in practice, none of it happened. And labor recruiters do not share the same interest as employers. And again, in our interventions, this is key. When we go meet to discuss any policy instruments, you often find, especially in the case of domestic work, it might also be in the case of government, but specifically in domestic work, you always find you have representatives from the government, recruitment agencies. Often the migrant workers are absent. If we're lucky, there's someone who's like proxy, either a trade union or an NGO, and some international organizations. And recruitment agencies here play the role of the employers, but they're not, and they don't have the interest of neither the employer nor the worker at heart. And this is very important, again, going forward in which lens do we see the recruitment agencies through. And the assumption behind policies and programs seeking to improve recruitment practices should be carefully reviewed. Again, the program found that conventional interventions tended to assume that all labor recruiters, often referred to as middlemen, are usually traffickers who dupe workers and employers, and hence recruiters have to be eliminated or tightly scrutinized, while workers and employers need to be educated to know how to manage them. Such assumptions are inaccurate and highly misleading. And I think we covered this in earlier slides. So again, it's interesting I encourage you to go deeper into the lessons learned through the publications that we have, because all of these are also explained of how did we reach this lesson, each of these lessons, and placed within a context. And again, it's based on assumptions, and we're trying to offer here kind of characteristics of better practice, hoping to influence strategies going forward. So I'm not going to go into details about them, just to also give time for the third part and then questions and answers. Thank you.
Okay, so over to basically the destination, back to me. We're looking here again, now we're looking specifically at what happens in the workplace. And this is perhaps one of the most important chapters of this, of our work, because it's what is most meaningful for the ILO. That's where the labor relationship takes place. It's not the pre-labor situation, the migration, the recruitment. Here we are at the actual what works in this area, and that's why when we look at this particular lessons learned document, it is, I think, 3 times thicker than all the others because it's from the ILO. So just a few words about the historical context. Responses to unfree work have varied really throughout history, depending on how work was defined and how struggles shaped the rules and norms of labor. Different themes have dominated concerns of different regulatory parties at different periods. Each one of these themes implied a different way of seeing the world and a different history of understanding. So, for instance, in antiquity, there's a whole series of regulations that existed to regulate debt, bonded labor in particular, and there's even cuneiform writings which document how debt relationships were structured and not structured. So this is not a an ancient concern as well. You have also, of course, the Abolishing Slavery Convention, the Slavery Convention of 1926. You have right after that the Eradicating Forced Labor with the ILO conventions and that followed, and more recently with the protocol. And then you have a whole series of regulation which is related to human trafficking with the Palermo Protocol, and then modern slavery, which is of a different type. It has different types of concerns. And these concerns are interesting. However, many forms of unfree labor remain to be addressed, such as women's unpaid work, unrecognized informal work, work involving poverty wages and others, which are still haven't been regulated. There are not sufficient standards to deal with this, and it's related to unfree work. So, there's a process in place, and I think it's important to see that context. So, what are the traditional, conventional approaches to this? Philippe mentioned a few of them just a while ago. Responses based on anti-trafficking person usually are structured around what are usually called the 4 Ps: prevention, protection, and prosecution, and partnerships. This is detailed in the Palermo Protocol. And so you can find them. It's very classical. You have many programs around the world that have been implemented over the last at least 20 years or more, which are structured around this 3 or 4 Ps, which I just mentioned. And there is responses based on a forced labor framework, which are slightly different, and they focus really on coercion. The protocol of 2014 and the supplementary measures recommendation of 2014, they highlight a series of measures to tackle the root causes, several protection measures, and specific actions against trafficking in person and forced labor, and other effective measures in implementation, consultations, and international cooperation. So this is practically quoting from some of these standards. So what were some of the different practices that we tried to focus on? So you have adaptive learning on successes and failures in responding to forced labor, which is very important. So this is what the program is about. I'm going to talk about identifying and addressing the root causes. Now, this is mentioned in Article 2F of the protocol, but it is rarely actually implemented. So here we have an opportunity of a program that we have actually tried to identify this. And then strengthening the support base for for marginalized workers at risk of forced labor. So in order to change a dynamic, a very unequal dynamic, you have to shift the power to those who are in a very vulnerable situation. So strengthening that the worker side is important in those types of contexts. They usually are not represented. They don't even have sometimes unions to represent them. So it's important to do through different means, and we'll see how we do that. So we have structured here in different sections, and here the lessons are we are related to the relationships between job markets and forced labor. And once again here, the scarcity of decent jobs and the absence of social protections are factors of market coercion for job seekers, and this affects their vulnerability to forced labor. Combined, they are important aggregate indicators of forced labor risks. This is very important because it's a defining way of looking at how the issues happen and not. And so we'll be able to go into more details in the Q&A, but the next point, which is related to this, is that in the context of migration, anti-trafficking and forced labor programs should not delink the analysis of labor issues that take place in the destination countries from the employment options and decent work gaps in the countries of origin. So combining, having both perspectives is very important. And this is very easy to forget because regulators only focus on the country they're based in, and they don't know what's happening in the country of origin. So this falls between the cracks, and in the end, we don't know. But as an international organization, we do know, thanks to this type of program, and that's why we're mentioning this. Then we look at the shifting power dynamics in labor relationships and how that's important. We have several lessons on that. Unfortunately, we won't have time to go into all of them, but here we have one of them. Is it recognizing how different forms of discrimination are perpetrated against migrant women is critical for better anti-trafficking and forced labor intervention. Such discrimination is a root factor of forced labor. We also have lessons learned in the framing of labor and freedoms. And here, more particularly, common anti-trafficking policy frameworks can sometimes concurrently undermine hard-won labor and other human rights, such as the right to work and the freedom of movement, or even efforts to promote decent work. So we see this particularly through very conservative anti-trafficking approaches, for instance, that tend to focus on penalizing employers or recruiters, and doesn't. While that's important, I think it's also important to have dialogue with employers, with intermediaries, with workers, and the migrant workers, particularly in these types of cases, to understand what the real issues are and develop a governance framework of demands based on freedom of association, collective bargaining, and labor inspection, which is strengthened to be able to do that. While migration may be profitable for employers who hire migrant workers because they are more affordable and amenable than local workers, such practices can generate labor market loopholes that erode decent work practices and the employment prospects of local workers. Migrant workers should not be blamed for taking the jobs of local workers. This is particularly important in the current context. We have a whole policy brief that we developed based on this. It is the practice of hiring migrant workers into substandard working conditions that is to blame. And we found this in all the countries, in which even countries of origin in the local context. Here's a very simple, appears simple, but is a very difficult and important lesson, is that migration bans increase vulnerability to human trafficking and forced labor. This idea that countries in origin will protect their workers is actually based, it actually reduces the options of women, and for women who are already marginalized by a whole set of other legal mechanisms, like having access to right over property, right over work. And so in that type of context, banning the opportunity for them to migrate is actually even a compounding obstacle to their rights. So very important. We have several studies that we have conducted with our partners, and including ourselves, showing specifically how these types of bans just simply don't work. The notion that migrant workers can easily be reintegrated into their home countries through ad hoc crisis-related reintegration programs runs against the labor market realities that prompted them to migrate in the first place. So this is very important. And right now, right after COVID, it's the priority in many countries of origin to reintegrate the populations that are coming back to the countries of origin, as if we can have some magical wand that can we can strike and say this is going to be they're going to be reintegrated. The reality is that the reason why they're migrating is because of the structural transformation of the economy, the incapacity to absorb all these people within the local economy. And so if you really want to reintegrate, you have to have jobs in the first place. So I think it's going back to the ABC, and not necessarily think that, of course, reintegration measures are important. We're not saying that they aren't, but I think it's important not to overdo the expectations of what reintegration measures claim that they will do, when in reality, there are structural reasons why those reintegration interventions are not likely to be very effective. Here's a series of lessons on understanding unfree labor. In the context of scarcity of decent work, most labor relationships, however abusive they may be, are consensual, even if they are unfree. In such contexts, forced labor frameworks, which are based on coercion, including forced labor surveys, are not always helpful in identifying abusive labor relationships. So this goes at the core of what forced labor means. Is it the best way of looking at unfree work, particularly in the context in contexts where there's limited employment opportunities or limited decent work? So very important to look into. Finally, we have a whole list of assumptions, as we had in the previous lessons. And here we have some characteristics of the conventional practices, of providing assistance to victims, and supporting migrant workers exclusively through unions and specialized NGOs. And here we show how there are some better practices through provision of services to all workers based on and tailored to their demands, and support to freedom of association and self-organizing of workers, the practice of using worker centers as a space to to support workers who don't have a voice, at least as a preliminary step, is something also that we have researched and practiced throughout the program. So I'll go very quickly because we're coming here to so just going to the way forward, the conclusion. I'll answer more questions if you have any on the specific lessons in destination countries, but here, just a few conclusions. With a prolonged 20-year agrarian crisis, the rural worlds of South Asia has been going through a process of structural transformation, making it increasingly hard for the majority of rural population to make ends meet. Labor in agriculture has consistently dropped over the years. The metros of South Asia have been unable to absorb significant proportions of surplus labor that manufacturing and industries used to absorb in the past century. And female labor force participation in several South Asian countries has been either declining or stagnating. In many rural areas, it's not just that decent jobs for women are usually not there, it's also that working women are highly stigmatized, leaving them few options except to either stay at home in poverty or survive in the informal economy in undervalued and stigmatized jobs or seek work abroad. So this is related to the countries of origin. On the destination side, in the Gulf, while employment of migrant workers has been growing, enabling many to earn more than they would have at home, in practice, real wages of migrant workers have been stagnating at relatively low levels, while their voices remain repressed. In the Levant, particularly Lebanon and Jordan, they have been beset by profound labor market transformations related to the refugee crisis, economic stagnation or recession that have been pauperizing the population. As a result, there's growing incapacity of many employers to pay agreed wages to migrant workers and guarantee decent work. So in Lebanon, for instance, even the number of migrant workers has significantly declined. So vulnerabilities to forced labor actually increased throughout the program and was further compounded by the COVID pandemic, as Philippe also suggested. While the program provided direct support to 450,000 women, supported organizing in over 180,000 migrant women, and successfully advocated for important policy measures, these interventions only prevented the situation from getting significantly worse through different types of regulations that were advocated on different issues that we can talk about in the Q&A. As a way forward, anyone interested in taking action against forced labor and human trafficking has to go beyond the peripheral direct measures that a program can undertake, such as safe migration, fair recruitment, or labor audits, and highlight macro policies that are needed to really make a difference in line with the SDG agenda. So, for instance, position productive employment and decent work of both women and men at the center of long-term national development plans, strategies, and macroeconomic policies. Policies should be in place to effectively respond to surplus labor emerging during the periods of structural transformation, particularly in these countries of origin. Explicitly acknowledge and include excluded occupations and types of workers under the fold of general law, labor law protections. It is very important that migrant workers, domestic workers, and other excluded workers, such as agriculture workers, are given full labor protections. Legal and policy measures are important. And this is a policy decision. It's often crystallized in the labor laws. The exclusions are almost in every single country in which we worked, specifically singling out domestic work as not covered by the labor law. And so, there's an importance to basically bring it back into the fold of protections. This is just one example. Many other sectors are excluded. It's also important to guarantee employment for all while recognizing the specific vulnerabilities of marginalized populations. Waiting exclusively for foreign investments to drive job creation does not work. Employment should be guaranteed by law and promoted by policies, whether it's to public or private employment. Examples of effective employment promotion policies exist throughout countries and different periods. The Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Act in India is a good example. The New Deal in the US is another example. a bit some time passed. Then you have fourth point is to establish robust social protection floors, enabling populations who do not have the means to make ends meet to access basic services that prevent them from falling or further or remaining in poverty. These measures are particularly important during periods of structural economic transformations that may see the emergence of significant numbers of unemployed, underemployed, or informal workers. And fifth, remove mobility and employment restrictions for women. The program closely reviewed mobility restrictions in several countries, and bans on women's mobility and in occupational sectors are a violation of their human rights and are also ineffective. And finally, expand the support work basis for migrant and other vulnerable workers, women workers, to be able to avail their labor and other human rights and more effectively participate in policies making that affects them. So as Philippe mentioned, these are policies that are well known. They need political commitment. So with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Andrew. Over to you.
Do you want to take the screen down? Great, thank you, Igor. Yeah, you've had a long presentation, so just a few extra words from me, some reflections from the FCDO side. I'm Andrew Clayton. I'm the Senior Social Development Advisor in the Indo-Pacific Regional Department in the FCDO, and have been the lead advisor for Working Freedom and more broadly on our work on forced labour and trafficking in the region. And I've been closely involved in Working Freedom for the last 6 years. As Philippe said at the beginning, it is a unique partnership for FCDO and ILO to work together over such a long period of time. It is one of our largest and certainly our longest programs within DFID FCDO on forced labour and trafficking, and I think it's generated a huge amount of interest within the organisation and more broadly across UK government over the years. I guess a few sort of key points I want to say from my side. I think first of all, it has been a groundbreaking programme, and I think as the presentations from Zaina and Igor showed us, that it has really been challenging and questioning many of the assumptions we've had about how best to tackle forced labour and trafficking, and thrown up a whole complex number of issues. And I guess one of the real strengths of the programme is it recognises the complexity of the issues. It recognises these complex social, political and economic drivers of forced labour, and that they can't be treated in isolation. And that's challenging because there aren't often, as we know, any easy answers on that. I think what's really impressed me about the programme has been the way it's evolved over the years and responded to the learning. So going right back to the beginning, there was a big push around pre-departure training in communities, and that certainly one of the pressures from the DFID side then was to, quantitative targets on number of communities reached. And I think recognition that in itself didn't provide that protective work for women, because it wasn't looking at the broader agrarian crisis which was driving women into unsafe work. So I think the programme has evolved its approach and continues to evolve over the years, and I think it's really looked across the whole sort of the working from source communities to migration routes to destination countries, and that's certainly amongst FCDO programs fairly unique, and I think a real strength of the program. And I think the other thing is the program is adapted to changing context. So I'll give you a good example is when the COVID pandemic outbreak, Igor and I were having very regular conversations about the impact that was having on migrant workers, both in the Middle East and in South Asia. And so we agree with ILO to repurpose some of the funding to support migrant workers who've been laid off in the Middle East, and also help them with reintegration back to home communities. I think that adaptability of the program has been great. I think from our side, the relationship with ILO has worked very well. I think it's strong leadership both at headquarters, regional, for the program level, but also at the national level. And I think that the national coordinators in country have really helped drive the work forward in country, and have become really experts in this. And I think that's been a great strength of the program. And then just finally, I mean, I think, you know, this is the last year of the program in terms of FCDO's involvement. I think this meeting today is great because I think what we really want to sort of work with ILO on this year is disseminating lessons from ILO to a much wider audience. And as I think as some of the you know, points raised in the presentation before, it cuts across so many areas beyond what was often seen as the traffic and forced labor issues around, you know, promoting decent work, around employment rights. And I think that's the challenge going forward in the next year, is to really disseminate these lessons, and the very complex lessons which don't have necessarily easy answers or very straightforward policy recommendations. But I think starting that dialogue over the last year is going to be really important, and certainly we're looking forward to working with ILO on that, and obviously very pleased to be here today. Thank you.
So Dagmar, are you there? Okay, we're gonna, if you want to take the questions,
Yes,
moderate the question Q&A.
No, I'm definitely here, Igor. You just went ahead, that's fine. So I think question and answers we can do. We have, I don't know if I can see the chat box. Maybe, do you have access, Igor, to chat box? And otherwise I would
Yeah, we
like
have the access. We can start opening the mic, and then
Right,
in the meantime,
so-
we'll look at the chat messages. And
Okay, so I would like to start with maybe asking about three participants here, if anyone would like to ask something to the presenters. Maybe you can just open your microphone and speak. I'm not sure I see any hands. How do I do that? Participants here. Okay, so I do have a hand here from Namrata. Can you please put on your microphone and your camera and introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much. So this is Namrata here from Equidem. And I just first want to congratulate Igor and the rest of the Work and Freedom team for a really phenomenal effort spanning a decade. It's a really wonderful program. So I just had a quick question in relation to the recruitment fee matter, where one of your findings looked at women, and you said that the recruitment fees for women was essentially lower on average than for men. And my larger question is that because women's wages are also less, so the sort of fee to wage ratio is less? That's the main question I had, but thank you. This has been such an illuminating presentation, and congratulations on your efforts.
Thank you for that question. Do I have other hands? Anyone who would like to ask a question? I can't see any further hands, but I think there might be some questions in the chat box. Now I lost Igor and company. Ah, no, there you are. Okay, good. All right, over to you, Igor. Maybe you wish to also
Sure.
ask other colleagues from the WIF team to come in.
so thank you, Namrata. The reason why the cost of migration of women is lower is it has to do with the demand for work in West Asian countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, but many of the Gulf countries. The labor market there is shifting. There is, despite perceptions, for instance, female labor force participation has increased in some of these countries, which means that at home there's a need for, and with different types of evolving households, there is need for support, and so there's an enormous demand that is usually in the destination countries, but also in the big metros of South Asia, in Delhi and Mumbai and so on. so that basically they really need the workers, and so they're ready to sometimes even pay to bring in these workers. And that's not the same situation it is for male workers. When you have, like, for construction workers, it's a very different dynamic. So I mean, this might be an explanation, but I think there's something to do with that. We know of several instances where recruitment agencies have told us that they actually pay the recruitment agencies in countries of origin to identify workers, which is sort of a reverse dynamic that you see with say male workers in the construction sector and other sectors. It doesn't mean that the recruitment fees for women don't exist. Yes, they do, and there's various different practices, but in general, there's even a survey that one of our partners here conducted with us, and it showed very clearly how the cost for women's migration was lower in Bangladesh than it is for men. So we have
yeah, we have two more questions.
Go ahead.
Patrick and Christian. Patrick first, please unmute and put on your camera and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much. This has been an absolutely fascinating session, and we're doing some research with IFPRI looking at this program and the latest manifestations of it. And one question we're finding, looking at migration from Bangladesh and Nepal, but particularly from Nepal, is we've looked at the source country and the destination country, but in some cases, there is the process in between, which also can have vulnerability. So is there any, are there reflections or lessons on what happens between leaving the source country and arriving at the destination country?
Thank you. Should we take Christian as well? And then we go back to, yeah, Christian, please.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for the very detailed presentations. I have a question related to the way forward, and related to what some of the presenters have said about the fact that in some contexts, intermediaries who are sometimes maligned are needed as a potential way out for migrant workers to get out of forced labor situations. And also the fact that if we look at the sort of the bilateral dynamics of labor migration, a lot of countries of origin are focused on, as was stated, promoting labor migration, making sure that there is sort of a continuing flow of labor so that remittances can come back. So their interests are very much focused on that. So it seems to me that we have to find some way to build up a pressure on countries of origin to put processes in place where intermediaries are no longer needed to guarantee a way out or to safeguard workers' rights. So against that context, and also in view of the fact that the UK government, who have been supporting this program for a decade now, will be exiting, where do you think this support should come from, or who do we need to bring to the table, us who are doing advocacy, talking to governments in terms of really influencing conditions in countries of destination? What leverage is there, and how would you judge that? Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Over to you, Igor and team.
Yeah, I would like to, maybe one of my team maybe could answer, maybe Neha or Suha.
Sorry, not to make you wait. So I'll just address the second question first, and then maybe our colleagues would come in. So in fact, one of the things that maybe we didn't focus on today, because we were talking about the lessons learned, but not the journey of the program, is that we invested a lot in building partnerships. And already that's part of the sustainability of the program and the way forward. So beyond the lessons learned, we have partners on the ground who have been very involved in implementing the program and sharing good practices and understanding and help us understand the challenges, who will also take this further. And in terms of the labor recruiters, just also to clarify one point, it's not about working with giving excuses to the intermediaries or to the unscrupulous intermediaries, but not to completely disregard them from the approach, which often is happening, because often the approach is to work with recruitment agencies, non-recruitment agencies. And here we're inviting to see the bigger picture and try to come up with mechanisms and to reach out to everyone. So, and not using, like just the moral approach, because those who do wrong will continue to do wrong, whatever you preach, right? So it's more finding an institutional mechanism on how to create this enabling environment where labor recruiters who may be needed at some point are also targeted through certain instruments to change the expectations from them and the relationship in the labor dynamics. So this is my contribution.
Go ahead now.
Thanks, Igor. Just to add to what Zaina said, and I'm sorry I didn't get the first question because my audio broke up. But I'd just like to add by saying that I think the importance of sub-agents, as we call them in South Asia, or smaller intermediaries, I think is something to really underscore here, because the distance that migrant workers have to traverse to access, the basic certification that is required for the migration process, be it the legal way, the formal way, or the informal way, is I think important to really recognize. I mean, Christian, you've worked in Nepal, and just the fact that a lot of the medical certification, for example, workers need to come all the way to Kathmandu from different parts. It takes them days to come, and this is just a service which is just not accessible. So negotiating the big city, negotiating appointments, I think there is a service that these smaller agents do, and many of them tend to be kin networks, or sort of people that they know from the village and they trust immensely. If I may also just add that, in terms of taking these lessons forward, I think it's something that has resonated in my experience of working in different parts of India, that a lot of women do depend on public employment programs where they work, whether they work on these public employment programs before they leave, or they work on them after they come back. So I think it's important, again, to think about the conditions of work available to women in the informal economy in the source locations, and how then this has implications for the choice that they can really exercise where they go. So apart from focusing on, I think, better design of anti-trafficking programs, thinking of recruitment outcomes in a more holistic way, I think it's also really, really important to work with governments to strengthen really the public employment infrastructure where women then really get options to be able to make ends meet. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just respond, Dagmar, if it's okay with you, to I think the question that remains on Nepal. And there's another question, I think, on the chat, and then two questions. Okay, so what on the Nepal question about what interventions happen in between, say, now Nepal has a particular situation in which, because it bans migration in practice, many migrant women will go to India and then migrate from India to the Gulf countries. And So there is particular vulnerabilities involved in this because they will have to go in an irregular way through through India, and that of course increases the cost of migration for them in particular. And this is not this is not the only case. We've also seen this happen with workers from, for instance, Myanmar going to Jordan, who have to go through the whole different, very complicated itinerary to be able to get to Jordan, and which makes the cost of migration particularly high. Now, I think for our end, I think it's important to deal with this as much as possible from the country of destination, if it's possible, and the country of origin. So trying to advocate for the country of origin to remove the ban. And we have done that. We have had specific in Nepal. Not only have we talked with the Foreign Employment office there, the colleagues there, but also with members of parliament based on a research report. And I think they are convinced that the ban doesn't work and it's not effective. But then the position of the government there is that it needs to, there needs to be a bilateral agreement on the basis of which then things can be opened up. But at this stage, it's still very limited. So in practice, there's a ban that's still in place. So that's one end, and of course at the destination end, it's important to work there to try to make sure that the recruitment environment is regulated. In the case of Jordan, for example, in 2010 it did something very interesting. It basically banned all private recruitment in Jordan and started channeling most of the recruitment through public recruitment agencies from countries of origin, which were mostly from Bangladesh and from Sri Lanka. And so it has streamlined the recruitment. There are still a lot of problems and challenges, but it is important to see that sort of like that angle. So there's different ways of doing it, and I'm not saying these are the only ways of doing it, but I think these are some. The question about some of the positive policies that have happened in that. So as I said, often in the policy environments where we are in, advocating for no harm is important as well. So there have been many attempts to pass, for instance, bills that have come. I'm thinking particularly of India on anti-trafficking. There's at least 2 attempts to pass an anti-trafficking bill, which had a very criminal justice heavy bias on workers, and which also imposed made it very difficult for any recruiter to actually informal recruiter to actually exist, and that would basically make it very difficult for workers to find jobs. So it's undermining employment itself. And so we've been able to at least advocate, not just ourselves. Of course, this has been through many other civil society and other actors who have participated, including the special rapporteurs of the OHCHR, who have taken different stances on this. But this is a type of policy advocacy which is important. In the case of Jordan, there's a domestic work regulation that we commented on. So many governments do share some of the policies that they intend to pass, and we've been able to provide some comments where possible on these type of issues. Now, more recently, I think even a lot could be said about what happens in India in terms of regulating domestic work. Now, we haven't had any specific role in this, but I think that some of our partners who are present with us, including Nalini, maybe you could say a few words about the domestic work bill in Kerala and where it's going. But that does sound very exciting if it's actually accepted or not. So these are some preliminary costs. And then on Namrata's last question, which is on the cost of GBV, I think it's important to recognize these different types of factors without, of course, victimizing the worker, because there's a tendency particularly in countries of origin, to see all reports of violations of workers, particularly sexual harassment and so on as something which is bound to happen, and therefore it reinforces this sort of position that migration of women should be stopped and banned. So I think it's important to highlight these issues but at the same time not to use it as a pretext to stop migration and employment options, which in the case of scarcity of decent work options is important. So I'll leave it there. I think there's a few maybe other people who would like to say a few other questions.
Do we have anyone further who would like to say something or ask a question? No?
We may have some questions here from IDWF.
Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, the ILO team, for the wonderful presentation. I hope the lessons learned and many critical points and issues should have raised in more regional and international forums and discussion, just like in the IMRF that we had in May. Because many lessons are very useful indeed. I'm for the IDWF team, where we have a few colleagues here and also on the Zoom room. We are very happy to be present to hear your lessons. My questions is really related to the recruitment, which is complicated, as you mentioned that we have to look at to the wider market dynamics, and surely we are not able to have, yeah, you mentioned the brokers, the intermediaries, they also have their roles, but there are a lot of hierarchies in it, and also financial agencies are in it, like the debt bondage, excessive agency fee, and the workers are being taken to the loan companies to borrow the loans in order to pay the agency fees. So if we look into the wider market dynamics, is like who is deciding who, because the recruitment agencies also complaining the intermediaries who have, I mean, the we call it cowhead, or the brokers in the village level, who have got a lot of money from them and also charge a lot as well. So and then in order to go away from the government monitoring system, they try to hide the recruitment fees that they collected, and then there are certain loan companies and financial agencies were in place in all these dynamics. So I feel like that we have to have a more breaking down on all these, what you mentioned, market dynamics, including the financial agencies, as well, not only the loan companies, but also the banks and even national banks are involved. Yeah, we have seen a lot of cases, but we don't have any capacity to do any studies in it. So yeah, so this will be my observation and also a question, where are the financial agencies in this recruitment market and dynamics? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for the detailed presentation. I am from Africa, Tanzania, though I'm not in this study, but we are the region whereby we can call country of origin for migrant domestic workers. I work for IDWF as a regional coordinator. Yeah, my issue is a comment, and I liked Zena when she said the involvement of workers, and not only workers, domestic workers and trade union. We have a case study, a good practice in Zanzibar, whereby they are doing orientation on pre-departure, whereby they include the immigration department, labor, and also recruitment agency and recruitment, recruitment agency, but who are them? Who are they? The people who are involved personally to recruit, legal recruitment people who sent domestic workers to Oman, to Kuwait, to Jordan, to Saudi Arabia. And also in this area, they will also include the foreign department, because in most cases, when you look at this issue of employment, it's like people are going to get job in the country of destination. Therefore, we've been practicing this and it works. And also organizing the migrant domestic workers before their departure. Therefore, it has helped the union, for example, when through this training, when domestic workers want to go outside, first of all, because they are organized, they will report to the union of domestic workers. And if there is any case, any problem, they will even call the domestic workers union that we have got this problem. And it has helped us to track on where they are working, what kind of problems they are doing. Hence that in Oman now, when they arrive in Oman, they will get, sometimes they get the orientation at the embassy. And these migrant domestic workers now are known where they are working. There are groups of different groups of domestic workers and their leaders. And so in so doing, it has helped even the government of Zanzibar to get concern or to get issues. For example, I remember there was a case of a migrant domestic worker who was married, was abused in Oman. And she had to call back to our union in Zanzibar that I'm getting this and problem, and also call the husband. And therefore, all of them went to the government authority to report there's this thing which is happening, and therefore we need to look at the employment recruitment agency who sent this, who facilitated this employment to Oman. And in doing so, they were able to curb some of the problem with the employer in the country of destination. As you rightly said, sometimes there's a disconnection between the recruitment agency from the country of origin and the country of destination. It is this person, the recruitment agency from the country of origin, who knows the country, the recruitment in the country of destination. Therefore, because it was done together, it was very easy to identify the recruitment agency in the country of origin. Therefore, what are my issues? Sometimes organizing migrant domestic workers from the country of origin or also in the country of destination by the domestic workers themselves is very, very important, or by the domestic workers union, because domestic workers in the country of destination, they know each other. But also if we identify them in the country of origin, it is very, very easy even to push, to pressurize the government to have this monitoring, this monitoring mechanism, but also come to solve some of the solutions which are happening to the domestic workers, but also the recruitment agency. Because the key player here are these recruitment agencies in the country of destination and in the country of origin. But if we work as a team, like now in Zanzibar, we have formed even a task force at the national level, which includes key department from the government, trade unions, but also the domestic workers themselves, because we can't speak for them, but they know who is going where. They have a network. Therefore, we need to involve them in this kind of recruitment corridor, even the process. Many times we exclude, even in policy, we exclude the workers. It is also like the government will sit with the government. Like in Uganda, the trade union for domestic workers had to come on board and ask the government, how do you make the policies for migrant domestic workers without even involving the union? It is us. Because when the problems happens, the domestic workers will always call the workers. But the government will sit only with the recruitment agency and they make policies without involving those people who are all the organizations which are dealing with the workers, or without involving the domestic workers themselves, because they have issues which could help these policies. Yeah, I just wanted to contribute. This is something like a good practice which is happening in Zanzibar, whereby is one of the country of origin for many migrant domestic workers going to Gulf countries. Thank you. If I may add.
Since Vicky is talking about organizing, because in the past few years in Asia, we have been focusing on organizing migrant domestic workers in the destination. We no more work more on the like pre-departure training in the countries of origin, because in Asia, it's simply the power is so much imbalance between the countries of destination and countries of origins. So, and in our Asian countries, we also don't have the space and the necessary democratic room for the workers to have more influence in the policies. And the agencies are very, very powerful in our Asian countries as well. So we focus more on the migrant domestic workers organizing, so that we can have their group, we can have their representation and their voices. And we do see that with the building of the migrant domestic workers groups in the destination, we were able to achieve more recognition of the migrant domestic workers, and we have been invited into some social, we have started to be involved in some social dialogues with the governments and embassies as well. And we also have to make a cultural change as well, because the migration issues are because it's an intersection with women and race and like the how domestic workers is being undermined. So we have produced some documentary of migrant domestic workers. One of the documentary purely produced by migrant domestic workers in Malaysia by their own phone in the COVID-19. The documentary is called Rasa dan Asa. It was now having several screenings around. So this organizing that lead to the voices and representations are very, very important, I can see. And in our region, it must be the organizing in the destination is very important.
Thank you. I think we're just about, we've overstretched the time limit. I think so we probably have to close unless there is any burning questions. Over to you, Dagmar.
Okay, I think maybe you can, and thank you for those who contributed and asked questions also from within the room. I was not able to see you before, so I wasn't knowing that there were people in the room further. But maybe you can also discuss with colleagues who are there physically some of the kind of questions, so to say, you kind of alluded to and raised. Well, from my end, I really wish to thank Andrew, who has been with us throughout. I think I met Andrew almost on my first day in Delhi, almost. And it's been a wonderful journey. I am quite excited and hope that we, Andrew, can also look into the what was presented in a way about the way forward. Because as you also said, the kind of lessons and insights that this program has generated prompts us to think around how we work further on these issues in a kind of taking into account, really these lessons and working on the working conditions per se in both at both ends, I would say, and how to do that. So many things we can continue to collaborate on and discuss. Also, of course, Philippe, I want to thank you for your guidance and leadership, and my heart goes out to Igor and team. Project is not yet fully over, so still opportunities, right? But also to extend my appreciation to you, Igor, and also all those colleagues who work with you on the team in several countries, right? It's a big operation in that sense, and a lot of things have been done. So really looking forward to trying to kind of distill and further look at how we bring in all this into our work going forward. And thank you. I've really enjoyed being there with you today. Thank you.
No, I just don't want to add anything. Also, the only last word is also a thank not only to the partner who was there, but to all the ILO colleagues who worked very hard to make a difference in the ground in practice and to collect all this information to pass now the torch to other partners, including within the ILO. So thank you so much, Igor, and the rest of the team spread in different countries. Thank you.